Hi class, and welcome to this week's lecture. We're going to be covering the 18th and 19th centuries, but specifically within this lecture I'm going to be covering three movements within that time frame. So we'll start by talking about the Rococo period, and then we'll move into Neoclassicism, and then we'll end with Romanticism. And your chapter elaborates on a variety of other movements within this time period, but we're just going to focus on those three today within this lecture. But I wanted to start with a context for you. So within this period and at the turn of the 18th century, so in 1701, we have a period where historians have very much called the age of imperialism and absolutism. And here we have what we call a divine monarchy by the King of France at the time, who is Louis XIV. And you see him represented here, and in some ways this is a perfect portrait of kind of the aesthetics and the grandeur, excessive grandeur of this period at the turn of the century. So here we have the King of France, Louis XIV, depicted. He saw himself as the divine monarch. So in other words, that means that he believed that, and kings before him and after him also believed this, that he was given the monarchy, and this was divine rule. So in other words, it was God's choice that he be a king. And so this was a divine monarchy in which he was the chosen one in some senses. He also had power over everything. So this is an age of absolutism. What the king says goes, and also an age of imperialism. During his reign in France, Louis XIV actually declared himself the Sun King. That's just how much he believed that he was kind of divine rule, that he was a god himself. And you can see here the elaborate fashion choices that the king was interested in. So here we have an official portrait of the king at the time, at the turn of the century, where we see some of the symbols of wealth that the king wanted to be associated with himself to show his power. And so here you have a variety of things. For one, we'll notice his heels. These were custom-made heels just for the king. They're beautiful, right? Actually, the king was quite short, and so these heels would have made him much taller and more imposing as a figure. The other thing I like to note is the blue and the gold, the use of blue and gold. These are two colors, as we've seen in the past. I think when we talked about Christianity, we've talked about how purple and blue were colors of royalty and colors of divine royalty, so colors of the divine king, Christ. And so here he's using the color blue. Purple goes in the same way as blue. It's also associated with divinity and royalty, and gold is the same. And these two colors, purple, actually purple as well, blue and gold, but you see the use of blue and gold here. These would have been difficult colors to create. In order to dye fabric with blue and purple, these would have taken a more expensive dyes, and so here you see people with a lot of wealth, like the king himself, using blue as a symbol of status and wealth. The column is another symbol here, an object that's used in terms of symbolism, and of course we see lots of symbolism here, but I'm just going to focus on the column. Oftentimes you'll see a column used within iconography in terms of wealth and power is used as a powerful symbol. The column is not only harkens back to the classical past, the classical Roman past, where we see the classical columns often used within architecture in terms of one of the greatest societies of power that we have, which is the Roman society and Greek society, but also because columns are symbols of permanence. Oftentimes when you see a column, a Roman or Greek column, this would have been a symbol of permanence and strength, because these are very strong, permanent structures. And there's much more going on here too. We've got this elaborate red fabric that's kind of a drapery in the background with thick drapery, which would have been very expensive as well. But we won't go into other modes of power here, but you can see that the king is absolutely obsessed with power and wealth, and he's depicting that here. His taste was very eclectic, and as you see, self-indulgent in both artistic and political spheres. And we also see that this and other portraits of the king and his family. Here you have an image of the royal courts in the 18th century, and of course they model themselves after the aesthetics of the king during his reign until 1715. It's also important within this context to talk about display. So how were paintings displayed at this time? Because the display that we see here is very, very different than the display that we see today, modes of display that we see today. So at this time we have what we call salon settings. So this is not like a hair salon, okay? This is the French salons, which were gathering places held by aristocratic hostesses that reveled in social status. And this is where we ultimately have the display of paintings. So here you see just one of those spaces depicted here. You can see the paintings are kind of stacked upon one another all the way up to the ceiling. Here you have a kind of a less busy image of the salon than you have here. But it's important to note that these spaces would have been ones of art, not only art but also music. There would have been music in these spaces. They were also spaces of interaction. So there would have been noise, movement, conversation, and debate happening within these spaces. So now today we have very kind of quiet gallery spaces, but in the 18th and 19th century, especially in terms of salon display spaces, these would have been places where people would have interacted with one another. There would have been a lot of noise. People would have been moving around, conversing, debating about these paintings that they would have seen. It was an activity of the aristocratic classes. So this is something you would have done, as a social event. There would have been food. Oftentimes, instead of these wonderful salon spaces, which would have been very active spaces. Here's another image you see here. I'll actually point out the Oath of the Harashai painting. It's depicted here, which is one we'll look at a little later today in today's lecture. But instead, what do we have today? This is much more akin to the kinds of display spaces that we have today, right? Believe it or not, these are actual paintings, right? That would have been that are in a gallery. So the space is actually not important, but the specific space. But what I'm getting at, as you can see here, is the kind of key differences between these kind of active, loud spaces and what we have today, which are these kind of very quiet, serene, whitewashed spaces. And if we were in class together, I would ask you, okay, have you been to a gallery? How would you describe the spaces of contemporary galleries? And many of you probably would have said, quiet, fluorescent lighting, right? You would have had fluorescent lighting. Of course, in the 18th century, there wasn't fluorescent lighting. It was not invented. So you wouldn't have that, but it's very much a very different space. And now we have the whitewashing of the walls. We have minimal display. So look, instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in each row, and then we have a row of 3 or 4 or 5 paintings up to the ceiling. Instead of having like 50 or more paintings on each wall, you have instead 2 on each wall. So each painting gets its own space. And now we're not really interested in context in terms of the painting's context, what's around it. But at the time, it was very much that you would read the painting within the context of the paintings around it. So for instance, things would be organized in such a way where the bottom part, the arrow that the area where I'm pointing the arrow right now, these would probably be oh, whoops, looks like my battery's low. I have to charge. So I'll actually do that in just a second. But these at the bottom would have been reserved for kind of the less important paintings, so still lifes and portraits. And then as you move up, you would see more important paintings. So landscapes as you move up, and then finally history paintings. So you see that the neoclassical style, the Oath of the Hirashai, which we'll talk about, is represented here. It's a history painting. So of course the point here is that we see things that are very differently, kind of display very differently than we have today. I wanted to start also by talking about the classicists. So we'll talk about two different painters, Poussin and Rubens. Both were working just before the turn of the 18th century, so in the late 1600s and early 1700s, I suppose, as well. But we have here, they're important to talk about because in a second we'll talk about the Rococo and the Neoclassicists. And here we have the classicists who were the precursors of the neoclassicists. So Poussin believed, and you can see one of his paintings here, he believed that the aim of painting was to represent noble human actions. He represented elements like color to focus on these actions. And so here you see a real interest in the classical past. And this is within the context of Baroque art. But he was very interested in classical order. So, of course, the classical past is referenced here, not only in the foreground but also in the background. He was interested in organizing natural elements and figures into idealized compositions. As you can see, this is quite idealized, right? Everything seems quite perfect here. Even though we're seeing a natural landscape, that landscape has been organized within the classical grid. Okay, so if we were to put a grid on top of this painting, we'd actually see that everything is organized perfectly within that grid. And as I said, there's a look to Roman and Greek classical ruins that's very typical of the classical artists. And just to bring up a key term, many within the French Academy who favored this kind of classical style and principles of classical art were called Poussinistes. And this is basically a way for people to identify as followers of Poussin, so Poussinistes. And on the other side of that, we have Rubens. Both of these artists, so Poussin and Rubens, they were both working within the Baroque tradition, but in kind of very different ways. So the Flemish Baroque painter Peter Paul Rubens painted with diagonals rather than that classical grid that we just spoke about in terms of Poussin. And so there were two different camps. One was the people who followed Poussin, who thought the classical order was very important, using the classical grid was very important, and then there were the other set of people and French academics and artists who wanted to follow Rubens. So Rubens was much more interested, as you can see here, in painterly brush strokes, featuring a low-angled point of view. You can see here the diagonals of the painting point down. The line of sight points down towards this part of the painting where we have kind of this active scene within the waters. And here you have a complete disinterest in the grid, and instead a variety of different parts of this painting are trying to compete for our interests. So there's not one specific vanishing point, there's not one point of interest. Rather, it's kind of a busy painting where we can't really decide where to rest our eye. And this is specific. This is something that Rubens was interested in, and this is the type of work that he would have done at the time. So you have within the Baroque tradition, you have the Poussinistes and then the Rubenists. And these were two different sets of camps. One was very interested, as you see here, with linear clarity in the classical grid, and then you have the people who followed Rubens, as you see here, who were much more interested in diagonals and kind of disorder and chaos within their paintings. So this is the context through which we're going to look at the Rococo and also the neoclassical, as we'll see in just a second. So, following this classical movement, we have a movement that comes to the fore, which we call Rococo. It's a term derived from small decorative stones and shells. That's basically what Rococo means. And here we have Fragonard is one of the important painters who we'll talk more about in just a second. And I believe I posted a video this week. Did I? No, I can't remember. I can't remember which one I posted, but I might have posted a video about one of his paintings, or we're going to talk about it in a second. We'll see. So Rococo developed in France when Louis XV, so the next French king, moved the French court to Versailles. This is a city just outside of Paris. I've actually been to this palace. It's about a 25, half an hour, minute train ride from Paris out to Versailles. And here you have this amazing palace that was dedicated or commissioned by the king. And this is where he ended up living, right? And look at the extravagance that we see here. So this is within the kind of late, some call it the late Baroque period, but really it's a reaction against the grandeur, symmetry, and strict regulations of the Baroque itself. These artists were much more interested in, I'll say, the F words, okay? So not the F word you think of when you think of the F word, okay? I'm making assumptions there. But these other F words, and I used to have a professor when I was an undergrad, when he introduced the Rococo, he would say all of the F words associated with the Rococo, so fun, frivolous, fanciful, floral, some of which I have shown here. And perhaps the other F word you think of, right, in terms of the F word, because you also have an interest in sexuality, sensuality, all these types of things that we'll actually look at in just a second. But this is in response to the Baroque. And so here we have Caravaggio, an artist we spoke about in terms of Baroque, where we have a real interest in order, an interest in specific kind of darks and lights, this contrast that we call tenebrism, and we've talked about that in the past. An interest in biblical scenery. You see here the Calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio. But instead we have a real interest in kind of the opposite of that, which is the fanciful, fun, right? These are things that we don't often see represented in the Bible. And to get at some of the important themes here within the Rococo, I could tell you about this painting, but I actually think that the historians associated with Khan Academy actually do a really good job of looking at it, and then they're able to kind of zoom in different ways. So let's watch a quick video by them. And I'll ask you to think about the ways in which those F words, fun, frivolous, right, floral, and then love itself, are come across here in this painting. And remember, this is a style that's very much associated with kind of the fun, frivolous lifestyle of the aristocracies, of the aristocrats in French society. So here, take a look at this video and we'll talk in just a second.
We're in the Louvre in Paris, and we're looking at one of the great 18th century French paintings, Pilgrimage to Cythera by Watteau.
So here we are looking at a Rococo painting, and the main subjects of Rococo paintings were the lifestyle of the aristocracy.
Well, we certainly have that. Cythera is an island in Greece, and it was believed perhaps to be the birthplace of the goddess Aphrodite.
So Cythera is an island that was mythically associated with the goddess of love.
Well, look, the sculpture of her has Cupid's bow tied around it, and we have a vine of roses growing up it. You can't miss the connotations of love here.
No, and there's a little Cupid sitting below that. He's got his quiver on the ground, as though he doesn't really need to do anything here, because love is all around him already.
And he seems to be tugging ever so gently on the skirt of the young woman who sits there so coyly.
As though he's urging her to fall in love. And of course her male companion seems to be doing the same thing, but she looks down rather demurely.
It's a bit of a conspiracy, isn't it? I'm not sure that she stands a chance.
As you follow the couples as they head down the bank toward the boat that is either going to take them away from Cythera or to Cythera.
I should say that art historians have been arguing this point for quite some time.
You can see that the couples get closer and closer toward a state of intimacy.
Well, that's right. When you look at the figures that are down below in the middle of the painting, you see a woman who holds the man's arm of her own volition. She doesn't need to be coaxed any longer. I see this progression of figures almost as a kind of dance. Look at the way the hands are together as it would be in a formal dance of the 18th century. You can see the prow of the ship with a beautifully carved nude woman, and above that, what is presumably a Cupid. There is red silk cloth that drapes the entire prow. We see garlands of flowers, and then you can see the oarsmen of the boat. They're ready to take these couples either to or from Cythera. I tend to think that they're going to Cythera because Watteau has made an effort to show us a destination. We see a dark outline, and presumably that is the island of Cythera.
And you can see the little putti that lead our eye back into that distance with that torch right above that island in the distance. On the other hand, there is that herm, that sculpture of Aphrodite that suggests that this island that we're seeing now is itself Cythera, the island of love, and that the figures are nostalgically, sadly getting ready to leave.
That's entirely possible, but I think it's also possible that it's both. That this is a painting that is about ambiguity and should not be read as a literal narrative.
Well, and I think you're right. Love here is represented as a dance, where couples take various positions in relationship to one another, sometimes moving in opposing directions, sometimes moving together, sometimes one pulls another toward them. We know that Watteau was influenced by opera and by plays, so maybe we're seeing some aspect of that here.
It's also important to remember that this was painted to be the reception piece for Watteau to be included in the Royal Academy of Art, and its intended audience was an aristocratic one that was used to formal dance.
This is a new type of painting called the Fête Galante, an outdoor entertainment for the aristocracy.
And interestingly, Watteau was a bit late getting this to the Academy, and that was because of private commissions that intervened. But when it was accepted, there was no category for the Fête Galante. But the painting was seen as so important that they created a new category so that it could be accepted. And this was rather revolutionary, especially considering that the Academy was strongly divided between two camps: the followers of the artist Rubens and the followers of the French artist Poussin.
That is a division between artists who adhere to a philosophy that says line is most important in painting, that clear outlines and internal modeling and a sense of finish where you don't see the brushwork is most important, versus the Rubenists, the followers of Rubens, who believed that color was most important. And it's so clear when you look at the luscious colors here that Watteau was an adherent to the Rubenist ideas.
There's no question that the Rubenists carried the day at this point.
Absolutely, and here you can see that the outlines are soft, figures merge a little bit into the background. We have lovely passages where we can see the hand of the artist. This is something that is very typical of Baroque art with Rubens, and also here in Rococo art with Watteau.
So this is a period that we call the Rococo, and it is the Ancien regime, that is, it is the last century that the nobility will rule France.
The nobility, the royal family, were less than a century away from the French Revolution, which will, of course, annihilate this way of life, literally, and usher in what we, in many ways, consider the modern world.
And so here we see an image of the aristocracy at play, of this fantasy of the world that they had created for themselves, but here within a fantastical setting.
All right, so you see here, as we heard with the video, you see real interest here in love and kind of the frivolous events associated with love, things that we do on the weekend, right? Fun stuff that doesn't really concern us, right? And so we have a real look away from the Baroque style that came before this and the rejection of that style, and instead a real interest in kind of, the lighter kind of things in life. And you also see this in Fragonard's The Swing. I'm not going to get into this much, but I would ask you, okay, how do you see this here? And I'm sure you would say, okay, well, let's think about those F words. There's lots of fun implicit here. It's a representation of the higher classes, right? These are people who have free time, so they have enough free time to just be out, swinging during the day, enjoying their life, enjoying their wealth and power. This is not a style that we associate with the lower classes, the working classes, who would have not had time, who would not have had time to enjoy themselves in such a way. Um, as these higher classes had. And so here you see a woman and two different men who are just kind of enjoying the swing. The one man pushes this woman back and forth. She's, having such a good time, and she slips her shoe off, kind of kicks it off in kind of a flirty fashion. And she, of course, knows, or perhaps she doesn't know, that there's a man down here looking right up her skirt, right? And so here again we have associations with kind of love and lust that we often see within this style. And there's much more going on here, but you can see the interest in kind of those F words and a real resistance to the more serious tone and kind of style that you see in the Baroque period prior to this. And then after this, we have a move towards Neoclassicism. And this, again, so here we have another movement which is in resistance to the movement prior to it. So after kind of the Rococo style, we have Neoclassicism, which is very much a rejection of the self-indulgence of the Rococo style. And this is especially at a time where we have the unearthing of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And these are two very important ancient sites which were unearthed at this time. So you might have heard of Pompeii if you know of the history of the Italian peninsula. You probably heard of Pompeii, which was an ancient city which was uncovered in 1748. And so this uncovered much of the historical classical past of Rome, where we have all of a sudden, well, I'm sorry, not Rome, but of kind of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, where we have these amazing classical artifacts which are unearthed because they were covered by a volcanic ash. Because a nearby volcano, you can see the volcano here, and in the foreground you see an image of Pompeii. But this was the Mount Vesuvius, which unexpectedly erupted and covered everything within the town of Pompeii. So completely covered, and because of this, it completely saved everything there. In some senses, it preserved it, so that otherwise, the art and architecture, which would have decayed and over time and collapsed over time, has actually been preserved. So we have all of this amazing artwork and architecture from the classical past, which is unearthed at this time. And classical people who were interested in the classical past were very, very interested in these artifacts. And so the movement Neoclassicism that comes to the fore at this point in history is very much interested in that classical past. That's why we have the name Neoclassicism, so new classicism, an interest in that classical past, and also an interest in the classical artists, which we spoke of whom we spoke just a couple minutes ago earlier in the lecture when we talked about Poussin and Rubens. Specifically, these artists were interested in, you can probably guess, Poussin much more than Rubens, because Poussin was much more interested in classical order and the grid. This is also at a time where we have Napoleon's invasion of the Italian peninsula, where he brought back classical sculpture. So he actually, of course, invaded Italy and stole all these beautiful Roman artifacts. And these informed French architecture at the time. We have this in the Arc de Triomphe, and also an important prominent church which was constructed at the time, La Madeleine. And here you have these two pieces of French architecture at the time, which actually look like Italian architecture, right? They look straight to, you would think that these both are from the Italian continent, but they're not, or the Italian peninsula, but they're not. So here you have neoclassical art being used as a way to legitimize the empire, the French Empire at the time. This is also within the context of the Age of Enlightenment. Here we have a center on ideas based on reason as the primary point of authority and legitimacy. So everybody's thinking of reason, right, in terms, looking kind of away from skepticism on reason, and instead thinking about science, right? A little bit looking away from religion because there's more of an emphasis on science and an interest in important ideals at the time, including liberty, progress, and tolerance. So the art world follows. There's an interest in reason, which happens pictorially as well, and we see that with classical order, an interest in harmony, and of course moral perfection. So in the paintings that we are going to talk about right now, we often see an interest in morality and virtue. So looking to the classical past is very much a way that we see artists trying to access morality and virtue. So here you have inspiration from Greek and Roman art. So we have a Roman story here, a classical Roman story here, where we have a water nymph advising Numa, one of the founders of Rome, advising him in terms of establishing Roman rules, but reminding him that we always must think, remember, and look to the heavens for guidance as well. Also within this context, it's important to bring up the very preeminent artist Jacques-Louis David. David was a prolific neoclassical painter. He's kind of seen as one of the most important neoclassical, if not the most important neoclassical painters. He was very active during the French Revolution. He was a French revolutionary as well as an artist and a theorist. And here we have a very important painting called The Death of Marat. Marat was actually a figure, an important French political theorist at the time. He was also a physician and a scientist. But he was known for his work as a radical journalist within the French Revolution. He was a politician as well. And he was actually murdered by a woman who just came. He actually had a rare skin disease, to give you a bit of context, wherein in the evenings when he got home, he would have to take these baths with certain types of salts that would help him to kind of live his life with this rare skin disease. So here he was taking one of his baths in the evening. You can see here he's writing as part of his work, right? He was a journalist during the French Revolution. And here you have an image of, he was stabbed while in his bath, murdered because of his political work. And you see here, he was actually a friend of David, and so David took it pretty hard. So here we have a painting where you actually see the artist making a connection between David as a martyr for the cause, for the French Revolution, and Christ himself, who was the ultimate martyr, right, for the cause of Christianity. And so here you have a specific look to images which came before of an image of Christ being taken off of the cross. And this is the kind of iconography you often see in terms of that event, Christ being taken from the cross. You see Christ with his arm kind of draping down to the floor, his head falling off to his neck. I'm sorry, not his head falling off, but his neck, right, his limbs are all kind of just fragile. Of course, he's a dead body at this point. And so you see here a real interest in connecting Marat, who was a martyr for the cause, right? He was killed for the cause of the revolution. You see a link between him and the ultimate martyr, of course, represented here within the iconography of Christ. And then I also wanted to talk about the Oath of the Harashi, another very important neoclassical painting by David. And here we have another painting interested in morality, looking again to that classical past. So that's very common, right, for the neoclassical artists. So here you have a mix of passion and rationality, with rationality at the forefront. And so this is a look to a classical story, a story from the classical world, in which we have a Roman family. This is the Harashi family going off to fight another nearby town called Alba, in which Rome chose these three brothers, the Harashi brothers, to fight for the city. And then, of course, there's three other brothers from the city of Alba who have been chosen as well. So these three brothers will go off to fight those three brothers in this kind of epic battle. And so these brothers are taking the ultimate sacrifice. But it's also a story very much associated with virtuous behavior and sacrifice. And of course, you see the women of the family off to the side engaging in this very kind of rational behavior, or I'm sorry, irrational behavior. Emotions are here at the sidelines, but are also pressed to the sidelines for that reason, because what's important here is rationality. Okay, you also see the use of rationality and order through the architecture itself, the use of diagonal lines, which draw our eye back in space, but then again, we also have the forefront here as the most important part of the painting. So we have the oath itself, where these brothers actually put their hands up in the air and they say, we are here to sacrifice our lives for the greater good, right? Which is the good of the Roman Empire. So, not to get too much into this painting, but here you have rationality at the one side and irrationality at the other. This is being forefronted, while the kind of passion and irrationality of the women of the family is being pressed to the sidelines for the more important cause, which is the sacrifice that people have to make for their city. And this theorists have also talked about this in terms of the French Revolution. So as we know, David was also a revolutionary. He was for the French Revolution, against the monarchy, and so this painting has also been read within that context as one which would have educated people, citizens, within Paris and within France, and would have called them to action, much like these brothers were called to action to sacrifice themselves for the greater good and for the cause of the French Revolution. And then lastly, I want to talk about Romanticism. So here again we have another move away from earlier movements. Romanticism emphasized emotion itself. Here we have less of an emphasis on emotion and passion, and more of an interest in rationality and order. But Romanticism was very against that. It was interested in emotion specifically and in the individual and individualism, as well as the glorification and the awe of nature. And you can see that here in the painting by Friedrich the Wanderer. This is as I've said, in a reaction to the French Revolution, but also a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the aristocratic social and political norms of the Age of the Enlightenment, which we've spoken a bit about, and the scientific rationalization of nature. So what do we see here? Here we see that nature itself is not rationalized. It can't be. Rather, it is an uncontrollable force of power. It is unpredictable. And here we have a potential for cataclysmic extremes emphasized through the painting. Nature offered an alternative to the ordered world of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinkers. So while the Enlightenment thinkers and scientists prized science as being able to rationalize everything in the world, here Romantic thinkers and Romantic theorists argued against that and said, no, nature is something that we cannot control. It is uncontrollable. it's supreme, it's huge, right? And here we have the wanderer represented. He's centered at the center of the painting. The vanishing point is at center, so we have diagonals which come in from the sides, centering us right at the figure himself. His identity is unclear as he looks away from us, and that's because his identity is really not important. So in prior paintings, we see an interest in emotion and the figures themselves and their identities as being important to the storyline of the painting. But here, the person is unclear, and he's really not important, even though we see that it's possible that he's of the bourgeois class. You see, social class is actually not that important here, even though we see his clothing and his garb kind of make him look as though he's part of the bourgeoisie. But that's not really important. Social class is not important. What is important is landscape itself and nature itself. And this is something that we talk about in terms of one term that's important is the sublime. This is the extreme kind of power of nature over us as a people. And so even though he's at center and he seems to be at the summit, right? He's at the top of the world. He's actually quite tiny. When we look much more broadly at the painting, we see there's actually a peak in the distance, which is much, much more grand than he is. Nature itself consumes him. He becomes quite tiny within this landscape. And we also see this within another painting by Friedrich, Monk by the Sea, where it's even more so. We see an interest in the sublime, which is this philosophical term associated at this time with the greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement, and imitation. Sorry, I had a second where I couldn't see that word correctly. And so here we have the monk by the sea, who's just a tiny figure within this vast and dark space. Here we have the terrifying side of nature, a nature which can overpower us in just an instant, right? And I think that these paintings also have a contemporary relevance because within the contemporary landscape of today, where we actually talk well, we should be talking more about climate change when we have a president who's a climate denier, right? We have Trump who's not who actually denies climate change, even though we know locally we almost were hit by the Hurricane Harvey. And so we have Houston locally where people are just devastated by hurricanes. And then, of course, we have Puerto Rico and Florida also being devastated recently by a variety of hurricanes. We have climate change that is happening all around us, and we have these hurricanes as significant reminders of that. But here again, we have an interest in the power of nature to overcome anything that we believe, all of our accomplishments in the world, right? All the things that we place dear can all be kind of wiped out in a moment by nature. And this is something that even those romantic artists in the 1800s, at the turn of the 19th century, were very interested in at the time. And so that's kind of all I have for you today. I wanted to just get to those three movements, think about how they're all connected and how they all respond and respond to one another, but not only respond to one another, but also reject one another in certain ways. So I hope that that was helpful for you within the context of the chapter you're asked to read this week. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a great week.